Frayer is the Assistant Dean of Outreach and Engagement at Michigan State University. And Dave, hopefully you can hear us, and we will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I can absolutely hear all of you, and hope you can hear me. Is that a confirmation from there?
Yep, we hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So first of all, let me thank the folks from the NASPO team. I know putting on these conferences is never easy. And when you have a speaker who at the last minute was planning to be there in person and can't be, I know that creates a little bit of consternation and challenge. And I want to thank Brandy, Matt, Susan, the whole team from NASPO for helping support me through this last minute change. Second, I want to thank the folks from Penn State. I wore my blue shirt in honor of the Penn State folks today to thank them for hosting this event. We hosted it a couple years ago. I know it's a fantastic event. I've been to events at Penn State in the past. They always do such a fantastic job, and just want to thank them for allowing me to be here as well. And then third, I want to thank all of you for your flexibility to allow me to have this conversation with you via Zoom. I know that this is a very important topic that we're going to be talking about here today. This whole area of supplier relationships and what they mean to our organizations, or what they can mean to our organizations. And I really designed the session, as Matt indicated, to be very interactive. And really designed as a discussion. I know for those of you who are familiar with NASPO events, it's always great to have the microphone thrown around the room, and so hopefully we'll try and make use of that today. But once again, I really thank and appreciate everybody for allowing me to be here with you virtually today. The agenda that I thought we could follow here for this next 45 minutes or so is really to focus on 4 key questions. And these are probably questions that you face in your organizations, in your states, all of the time. And the answers sometimes can vary to these questions, but I thought if we had a really good deep discussion around these with some research-based insights that have come from years and years of studying relationships, I thought could be very helpful for all of you. And so the 4 questions we're going to try and cover today are, first of all, do supplier relationships matter? And it's an incredibly relevant question, because you will find that there is no consensus on this amongst folks that are out there practicing public procurement and frankly, procurement in the commercial sector as well. We see incredible evidence that they can be valuable and can matter, but there is no consensus in terms of what people really think. We'll talk a little bit about some of the common misconceptions about relationships. And I think that's important too, because that frames the broader discussion and what you can actually do to make relationships happen. And then we'll talk about some of the considerations for making relationships successful. I think that's also very important. And those can vary a little bit depending on the nature of the relationship and what your goals and objectives are. And then finally, I want to leave time to really talk about how do we transform our current purchasing practices to really incorporate and support relationships as a function of the work that we do. Obviously, we have to be really good stewards of public money, and there are some requirements and restrictions that go along with that. But I think in reality, there's a very significant opportunity to allow relationships to really permeate and add some value in those processes. So I want to spend some time talking about that. So that's really the agenda for today. Like I said, I thought we could start with this question: do supplier relationships really matter? And I'm going to pose this, frankly, to all of you there in the room. What do you think? Do supplier relationships matter? And if you want to share why you think that is the case, or why you think that is not the case, certainly would appreciate some input from the group. So that's the first question: do supplier relationships really matter? Okay, Matt, I'm going to interrupt because it sounds like you've got someone sharing and I cannot hear them. Is the squawk box on?
Oh, we'll just carry this around. That's fine.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I sure can now. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, I'm pretty loud. I was surprised you couldn't hear me all the way in Michigan. So I said, so yes, so this, in March 3rd, 2020, Tennessee experienced a series of really devastating tornadoes that kind of went across the entire state. We went in to the emergency management office to respond, procurement responds in the office with a team of about 5 people, because that is the amount of work that we had to do. On top of the fact that COVID, I guess, kind of hit there too. So day 2 in, I had a supplier call me and said, hey, you're calling us multiple times a day. We're talking on the phone 3 or 4 times a day. He goes, would you like me to come in and sit in the room with you? That was amazing, because not only was he able to respond faster, we had his undivided attention, but for the products that he couldn't get us, he was able to tell us that we were paying the wrong price or we were getting a good price. And so that was a really amazing relationship that was formed. We continue to this day. I mean, he calls me and he says, hey, how's it going? Hey, this agency wants to buy something. I'm not sure it's actually part of the contract. Can you help me figure it out? I'm not the contract administrator, but the relationship we made because of a shared experience was amazing. And I know that as long as he is in a salesman role, regardless of what company he goes to, that relationship is going to maintain. So that's just one, but there are many other examples I can give you during that time period.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that example. And it's actually a fantastic example, because that is often how we see some of these relationships evolve, right? We're in the midst of a disaster or some crisis that necessitates us perhaps doing things a little bit differently. And then all of a sudden that opens up opportunity. We start to look at, potentially in this particular case, right? Look at the supplier as more than just someone providing us with goods and services, but now helping problem solve, helping troubleshoot, helping provide market insight and knowledge, right? All of which are incredibly valuable for us in procurement. And suppliers have those capabilities when we can enable it in a safe and appropriate manner. So great example. Really appreciate that. Does anybody else have thoughts on this, including if you don't believe they matter, that's okay too. Anybody else like to share?
Come on, I know you all have opinions on this. Somebody?
Maybe
Okay.
flip the question slightly. Oh, you got somebody, Matt? Go ahead.
Yeah, we got somebody. You don't know him at all. You've never met this person, Dave.
Uh-oh.
Hi, Dave, it's Kelly.
Hi, Kelly. How are you?
I thought I'd bail you out with your lame question. So I'm not from public procurement by way of background. My career is mostly automotive, mostly with Chrysler and its various entities over a period of time. But another example, the supply of fascias. So if you're not, you may call them bumpers, but it's actually a fascia, which is the front covering over the front and rear bumper, plastic, lots of value add, very high capital costs. You can't just go from one supplier to another. It's extremely difficult to do. We had a supplier in Howell, Michigan. They experienced a devastating fire. We scrambled, a team went out there, and it was almost a total loss of the building, but we were able to save our tooling and some of the capital equipment that was needed. And because there's basically 2 suppliers for fascias in the entirety of North America. So we had one choice, and we had to go to their #1 competitor, who dropped everything that they could do to help us out and to help out this other company, loaning them people, loaning them equipment, loaning them whatever they needed their arch rival, but we did it. We didn't lose any production units. And the other thing that we did compared to some of our crosstown rivals, also known as Ford and General Motors, we brought out trucks, we brought out food, we brought out blankets for the employees. And we didn't lose any units, but some other guys did. So, so now I bought you time, NASPO people.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, I think, one of the, and I guess before I move on, let me just say this. Does anybody there believe that relationships for purchasing are problematic? There's something that we should be concerned about, or that that can lead to inappropriate or unacceptable behaviors? Is there anybody who is more on the contrarian side of this issue?
So I'll speak again.
Yeah.
So yes, I do. I believe both. So that same relationship could have gone very differently. And I'll give a different example. When a contract administrator gets too close to their supplier, it could be perceived as a conflict of interest. And the problems that could develop from that could be that I guess insider information essentially could be passed on to those suppliers, which is the same reason why we don't give contracts to our brothers or our cousins. And we recuse ourselves from any kind of contracting that could potentially seem like it was, it could be a conflict of interest.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so what's great about the examples that have been shared thus far, right, is we believe relationships matter, but relationships have to be managed, right? They're not just something that we automatically say are good. We have to ask the fundamental question, why? Why is a relationship important? And what is the right type of relationship that we really need to engage in if we're going to be successful delivering value for the people in our states, right? And this is what leads me to this second question about some of the most common misconceptions. And I'll spare all of you having to offer your thoughts on this first, but let me go ahead and kind of share with you what we've seen as I think one of the largest misconceptions. I would invite any of you to add in if you've seen this in your own environments, or if you have counter examples, please feel free to jump in. But there are a lot of people out there who fundamentally believe that relationships are always good, and that always, and they put them on a spectrum between negative and positive, okay? And that's how they view relationships. They say we have two kinds of relationships. We have negative relationships, we have positive relationships, and then we try and put our suppliers on this continuum that says, look, sometimes they're more negative, sometimes they're more positive. That is not the best way to think about supplier relationships in the context of your business. You should not be thinking positive and negative, right? Because frankly, there should not be negative relationships that we're engaged in, right? If we have a situation where we have a fundamentally negative relationship with a supplier, we need to be moving beyond that supplier. We need to be developing practices and processes and approaches to get us away from negative situations. Now, I understand sometimes we find ourselves boxed in, but the reality is that should never, ever be the fundamental direction that we're thinking relationships need to go in. A better way to think about that continuum is not negative to positive, but think about it in terms of its intensity, okay? Its intensity. If you look at the screen on the left-hand side, kind of defined some relationships as being transactional, right? And we have those relationships, right? If we're buying some simple commodity items that are in high supply, highly undifferentiated, lots of potential suppliers out there, lots of good value. Look, we probably don't need to do much more than a simple transactional type of relationship to get what we need. As you move to the right, though, sometimes you need cooperative relationships. You actually need the supplier to do more than what is their standard business practice, right? And so you seek their cooperation to change something in the way they do business, right? The example that was given earlier, right? Coming on site, that was a change in business practice that really led to some positive outcomes. And if you slide all the way to the right, you see what I would refer to as collaborative relationships. And the difference between cooperative and collaborative is where the change is necessitated, right? In cooperative relationships, you need the supplier to change what they're doing to facilitate improved performance. In collaborative relationships, the only way to get at the real value that you're seeking is for both organizations to actually change the way they go about basic business practices in the target area. Okay, so you're asking the supplier to change, and you are making change in your own organization, making change in the state, within the agency, in how you actually carry out work. And you'll notice in this continuum, there is no positive and there is no negative. There's simply choices along a continuum. And the difference is, as you move from left to right, what is required is increasing communication, more joint activity, more potential impact, in other words, greater value outcomes from the relationship, and increasing effort. Okay. And so now when you step back and say, okay, if this is the continuum that we're really trying to think through, now we start to realize what the challenge is. The challenge is we all have very limited resources. And so if we're going to invest resources in supplier relationships, we have to make sure they're the right supplier relationships for us to invest in time, effort, communication, joint activity, right? We cannot do this with everyone, nor would we want to do this with everyone. But there are going to be critical places, critical items, goods and services that you are acquiring, that the only way you're going to get the maximum value is by figuring out how to collaborate in this space. Okay. Does this make sense? Does this
Hey, Dave, we got
framework align? Yeah, go for
We
it.
got a comment over here for you.
Yeah.
So Arizona State University. So we've sort of taken this one step further.
Yep. You just cut out on me.
Is that better? Well,
Yep,
that's
there you
not-
are. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm not sure how much you heard. So ASU, Arizona State University. So we're doing some things that are a little bit controversial as it relates to this. So in some of our larger strategic RFPs, the product or service is an element of the RFP. It is not the only element of the RFP. So we are taking it further and saying, okay, not only what can you sell us or provide to us, but what can we provide to you? So for example, and perhaps it's a little bit more translatable in a higher ed setting, but internships, right? So can we provide interns to you? Can we educate your employees? Can we give you discounts on tuition because of your Starbucks is a good example of that, right? So we educate Starbucks employees. Can we collaborate on sustainability initiatives that aren't necessarily going to make either one of us money, but are better for the world, right? Or better for our mission, things like that. So we have those elements now in our RFPs and are asking suppliers to think collaboratively and come up with ideas where we can work together that have potentially nothing to do with the product or service. And interestingly, we have had recently some suppliers respond to RFPs and don't even respond on the goods or services that are in there. They're only responding on those collaborative things, which is interesting.
Absolutely. Great example. And the point that I think is so critical about what you're raising is unless you open yourself to these types of ideas and discussions, most of us don't necessarily recognize what's possible. Okay. Thank you for that example. Anybody else who's done this successfully or is trying to incorporate more collaborative elements into what you're doing?
I've got some NASPO headphones over here to incentivize you to speak. Who wants it? Come on. We got one.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
State of Tennessee, one thing that we've done on the solicitation side is that at pre-response conferences, it was just becoming so frustrating how closely vendors would play their cards and kind of wouldn't share things that they should. And they would kind of hold that as a gotcha card in case they weren't winning the procurement. So we tried to explore ways to make the vendors feel like they had more input when we're developing the solicitation versus, hey, we've already completed the draft documents. They probably aren't going to read them until the very end. So we did a couple of things. One was using a University of Tennessee process called Vested. We essentially tried to adapt elements of that where we involved this, we pre-qualified suppliers and we met with them prior to developing the actual RFP. They all had equal input. They all had equal representation. And it was like a more collaborative, technically the state was the one that developed everything, but we gave the suppliers much more. I felt like they felt like they had more skin in the game and actually got better insight into the state's requirements beyond just what was on the paper. I think that ultimately was a big success. It was very time intensive, but we've always been looking for ways to incorporate elements of that because it definitely helped the relationships, even with the vendors who ended up not winning. So
yeah, great example. And Kate Vitasik's vested process is a fantastic one. I think that there are a couple really critical points about what you've raised, and this is where I want the group's thinking really to start to evolve. Right, we have required processes in our states that try and ensure equality and fairness and all of these principles that we hold true and that we want to support. But there's an underlying assumption behind all of those processes that essentially say something down the lines of we know best exactly what we want. Okay. And when we're dealing with repetitive purchase items, when we're dealing with items that technology is not necessarily changing that rapidly on, when we're dealing with areas of the business and our states where there's not dramatic change and transformation, maybe we do know best, and maybe we can write the requirements sufficiently and appropriately enough to get exactly what we need. Okay. But my comment to all of you is I don't think that's the world that we are heading into, already experiencing to some extent. But my prediction for all of you is we are entering a period of unbelievable volatility, right? We have gone through really 40 plus years of increased globalization, increased outsourcing, increased reliance on suppliers for not only goods and services, but technical know-how, innovation, entrepreneurial thinking. This is really where the field has been going and evolving. And now all of a sudden, we have a lot of people who are saying, wait a minute, maybe all of this isn't good. Maybe this is dangerous. Maybe it puts us at risk, right? And it starts to challenge the very foundations behind what purchasing is meant to be. A lot of people really define purchasing very narrowly as a process discipline that's all about acquiring goods and services. But I think the examples that you all have raised really point out, no, procurement is a knowledge game. It's really about how do we acquire, how do we attract, how do we converse around the best possible ways of making things happen. So if you were to take the Tennessee example and say, okay, can we take our procurement process and break it into components where, part of it is exploration, but not exploration in the traditional sense where we go out with a ridiculous 400 question RFP to try and just get everybody in the world to tell us everything that they know, right? That's not helpful. It's not useful. It's not useful for you. It's not useful for suppliers. How do we really target collaborative discussion, target collaborative action, where we can actually have everyone win, not necessarily win a bid, but have everybody win through sharing of knowledge and insight. Okay. So again, you start to see these types of processes can be very effective, but they have to be positioned very carefully. Okay. So I want you to think about this concept of relationship intensity. Yes, go ahead.
Yep.
David,
we got a
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you because
No.
you're making good progress, and I appreciate the conversation as it relates to transactional through to cooperative. From the state of Delaware, I
Yeah.
can tell you in echoing what you're saying, many of our users, many of the folks that we rely on to build our scopes of work, look at the relationship as merely transactional. So they know what they need and they know what they want, but they don't evaluate it as a cooperative or even a collaborative relationship. They simply want us to go out and obtain it. And the challenge for us is to build the value associated with asking the right questions and questions in a 360 manner that takes it not just from the purchase, but through the maintenance to the implementation to turning it down at the end of its cycle, whatever it is, be it good or services, and particularly important in IT services. And so that continues to be the challenge. So from a very real perspective, we see that because they're not seeing the intrinsic value of developing that collaborative relationship until the vendor offers a suggestion that they didn't bother to think about because they didn't bother to plan. So I did want to comment about the conversation that you were having.
No,
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that. And it speaks very much to helping your internal stakeholders, your internal customers, really work through the desired outcome, right? At the end of the day, what is the real challenge here, right? Sometimes we frame things in very simple ways, right? I need beakers to be able to run data analysis in the forensics lab for our state police, right? That's something that is a common purchase that we have to deal with. But when the challenges we're facing as states can't easily be, defined into a single product or a standard service bucket, that's where these things become much more challenging. And that's frankly where collaboration tends to work best. But we have to enable it. We have to give people confidence within our agencies, right? Our internal constituents. We have to help them understand what's possible and that we can help create value for them. So many times we see procurement organizations who simply say, no, this is the process. These are the steps. You need to do all the work and come to us with your answer and we'll bless it, right? None of you in the room ever do those things. I understand that, but it does happen out there. And this is what we have to overcome. We have to overcome this reality that, hey, there are challenges that we're trying to solve that don't fit neatly into product and service buckets.
It just is a backup, yeah.
Was there additional comment? All right, let me roll forward a little bit because we got a couple other comments that I want to just make sure we get out on the table. So again, this notion of relationship intensity is really determined, that collaboration out to the far right is determined by the need for both organizations to potentially modify the way they do business, okay? To achieve the outcome that we're going for, it's the only way to get at it. And that's what really should be driving collaboration. But I want to bring up
Bring
a
it up
few
a
quick,
little. I'll let you
want
do
to bring
that.
up a few quick considerations for you. All right, in terms of what it takes to be successful, okay? And so the first thing is figuring out on that continuum, right? What is the right relationship? You got to think about the potential payoff against the effort, right? To go into establishing management. We cannot do this everywhere. We have to be very selective in where we apply these types of relationships. And just because, and this is really critical, just because we've defined an area where collaboration is the right approach doesn't necessarily mean we have the right suppliers available who have the right capability, the right mindset, that willingness, strategic and cultural alignment to actually be able to carry out collaboration in those spaces, right? Because at the end of the day, collaboration cannot be forced. Collaboration is something that is invited, and suppliers choose whether to collaborate or not. And when you have situations where you have suppliers who are unwilling to collaborate, move on. Do not waste your time, okay? It is a choice, but the payoff potentially of choosing to collaborate, choosing to be engaged in those deeper conversations can be significant, okay? So the first critical thing is, how do we select the right kind of relationship? And you've all seen these frameworks. I won't belabor this point, but I do want to make sure it's out there, right? This is the justification and the rationale for segmenting our supplier relationship, right? Because we cannot have intensive relationships with everyone. We have to figure out how are we going to categorize and work with different suppliers for different goods, services, and solutions that we're trying to acquire for our states. So just to give you an example of one simple organization who uses a 3-level, this is from a commercial organization. It's actually a product scenario. These are products that they're primarily purchasing. But they've come up with really a 3-level process where they create what they call alliances. Those are those highly collaborative relationships up at the top. The supplier partners, these are where they're really seeking collaboration. And then everybody else are simply suppliers. And suppliers are valued, they're good, they're important, but we don't make the same type of investment in time. And notice the breakdown, right? They've only got 11 alliance relationships, 115 partners, and 500 in the supplier category. And when you look at the totality of their spend, right, you see that long tail, right? The most critical higher spend suppliers tend to be in the upper 2 categories, because that's where investment of time and effort is typically going to pay off most, okay? But just understand that notion of segmenting suppliers. And then they go further to say, here's how we're going to define the attributes, the relationship attributes associated with that, right? So basic suppliers at the bottom of the pyramid, shorter term contracts, mainly commodity type, commonly available products, use competitive bidding. That's the primary strategy. There isn't a lot of reason to do anything more in that space. Partners have slightly longer time horizons, higher value, typically have multiple suppliers per family, right? So if you think about Kelly Lynch's example earlier from Stellantis with 2 different available suppliers, right? When we put all of our eggs in one basket, we do create risk, and we do find ourselves maybe with situations that we later are challenged to overcome. So are we thinking about these things through a strategic lens, right? And then alliances tend to be those longer term, very close collaborative relationships that involve joint design, joint cost reduction efforts, right? Because you can do cost reduction with a supplier even after you've signed the contract, if you build that collaborative mindset right up front, okay? The other thing that I think is really critical for all of you to be aware of is how we manage the relationship then, because this is another place where we get a lot of people having misconceptions about supply relationships. And I want to define for you three critical components to managing supplier relationships that I think are really important. The first, we talk about these a lot, right? We talk about the importance of visibility, transparency, and communication. But I want to define them for you briefly to just put in your mind what these actually mean in practice. So visibility is simply how far forward and backward we can see in our supply chain, right? So now we're talking about, hey, we have a relationship with a supplier who is providing us with goods and services. How far back beyond that supplier can I see, right? Do I understand who their suppliers are, who their suppliers' suppliers are? Do I understand my risk points? Do I start to understand where goods and services are coming from, right? Think about all the things that you experienced in the pandemic, where for the first time, we really started to ask some tough questions about, well, what is the origin source for all of these things that I'm buying through suppliers, through multiple tiers of things, right? Whether it's PPE or other items. And we need to be doing this type of analysis because there's significant risk to it. But visibility is simply how far backward, or in your cases, forward, inside the state, right down to the user level. How far can you see? Okay. Understand, visibility is something that you can attack directly. You can mandate it, you can require it in your contracts, you can report on it in terms of what your visibility looks like across your extended supply chains, and you can react based on risk points that you see evident when you do that visibility analysis, okay? But visibility is just how far forward and backward you can see in your supply chain through these relationships. Transparency for many of us is far more critical, okay? Because transparency is not just how far we can see, but what can we see, right? How much detail do we see and understand about the work that's going on in our supply chains with our suppliers and with their suppliers as we try and put together these relationships, okay? And here's where it becomes really difficult, because often suppliers who have been beaten up over the years through very competitive bidding processes that they feel, rightly or wrongly, they feel they've been disadvantaged through, right? They're going to be very hard pressed to feel good about providing transparency, because to create that transparency, to be able to see what are the business practices, what are the key risk points in how the business is performed, those are asking very different questions, and you can't mandate it. You have to develop trust in the relationships to allow that transparency to develop. So the original example that was brought up today, right? Clearly, there was trust in that relationship that allowed that supplier to open up and say, hey, why don't I come on site? And once they came on site, the opportunity to collaborate was there because trust existed. Okay, you have to develop trust, you have to validate your insights. Okay, don't just assume that what somebody tells you about what is going on in their organization or with their suppliers is true. You have to validate. You cannot assume that what you're being told is absolutely the truth. And you have to proactively manage relationships to maintain the transparency, right? You can't pay attention to a supplier at the time you're going through a contracting process and then ignore them for the rest of the time. Those are just not possible, okay? So visibility, how far forward and backward you can see. Transparency, how much detail, how deeply can you see? And then communication is really the glue that ties it all together, okay? And part of what I think a lot of people fail to understand when they think about communication in the context of supplier relationships is we are not communicating to a generic audience, right? Any more than when you communicate with your governors, when you communicate with your legislatures, when you communicate with your internal stakeholders and agencies inside your states, when you communicate with particular suppliers, you have to understand Who are you communicating with? What is the message that I'm trying to deliver to them? And how do I tailor it, right? Generic statements don't necessarily resonate equally with all of these audiences. And so you really have to think deeply. Third, you've got, a lot of people think communication is a one-way process. We just push it out there and everybody buys into it. But you have to confirm receipt and understanding. Did you receive the message? Do you understand the message? Can you explain to me what the message means? And how do we really do that? Or do we just push edicts out into the supply base and hope people really listen and understand? And then we have to actually monitor action resulting from that message. Okay, so visibility, transparency, and communication become vital for driving supplier relationships. Notice every one of these involves effort. It involves time, which again is why we really have to think carefully about where we're applying these principles and these ideas. Okay. All right. Last thing I wanted to bring up, because I know we're right up against time. I know you've got several other things that need to be accomplished this morning, but as we reflect on some of these things we've talked about, we have to think about how do we transform the current way we do things to support relationships. And this may be different for each of you. It may be different in each state. It may be different in different relationships with different agencies within your state, right? You may have some agencies with whom you have a very open, trusting, collaborative relationship. Use that. Make that a playing field for experimentation with some of these higher level types of relationships. And I will tell you, there's nothing wrong with actually suggesting that we're going to do some experimentation. We're going to try something a little bit different. We're going to meet all the requirements, right, that we have through our required procurement process. But we're going to do some experimentation in some places to see if we can achieve greater outcomes. Because there's no better way to convince people that something is possible, that something could have positive benefit than to actually demonstrate it, right? Success begets success. So if I was just throw it open for these last couple minutes that we have together, what are some things that you think you might be able to do, given what we've talked about here today, to help transform some of your current relationships or current processes to facilitate relationships? Anybody have any thoughts or ideas, any challenges that you see that we'd need to overcome to make this work?
Testing it out. We have the catch box. Can you hear me, Dave?
I can.
Great. So who's got a response?
Okay, we've heard a couple really nice examples already of thinking about how to transform what we do, right? From the folks from Arizona State, we've heard it from Tennessee, we've heard some things from Delaware of things that have been tried. What about the rest of you? Has anybody else tried some of this, and what did it take to actually transform the way you think about the procurement process in your state?
Who gets involvement with suppliers early on, whether it be RFIs or engaging them in the early on the solicitation process? Do I do it? RFIs? What do you do? Lois, do you want to speak to?
Here you go.
I just answer your.
See what I did? I got you raise your hand and then.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we engage in an RFI and asking them to provide as much information as they wish to share. What you're talking about would be a very new concept to us. So it would, I guess, need to have our whole process rethunk or revamped to help it make it work. So I guess the first thing would be is to see how it would relate to our policies and procedures and statutes and regulations.
Yeah. Yeah. So Lois, I really appreciate you being brave and being drafted into responding there. But look, it's really, your comment is so critical, because if you try and take this on as something to transform the way we do everything in the state, it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. But the opportunity is, can you identify a particular place, right? That internal agency that feels a strong relationship. Can you identify that perplexing purchase opportunity, right? Where maybe the solution is just ill-defined, right? And can you then use that single place to say, okay, we want to look at this opportunity against the rules, procedures, and requirements that we have. And can we find ways to try some things to see what would work? Okay. There are lots of potential places. And I think, frankly, that's what you have to do. You have to start with one single place. And to do so, right, you can't just say as procurement in your state, hey, we're just going to go do this, right? No, you got to have buy-in. You have to have buy-in all the way up, in some cases through the governor and the legislature. You've got to have support at the agency level, supporting whoever it is you're working with internally. You've got to be thinking about all the things that I know you're all worried, oh my gosh, we're going to get, we're going to have somebody file a grievance. Somebody's going to file, something that says they were treated unfairly in the process. But you've got to start somewhere and start to define what are those critical consideration points and critical. Once you've done it once and you have really good experience, it becomes much easier to try it again. Okay, so I appreciate that, Lois. Really, really great comment. Anybody else thinking about this and what you could do or couldn't do?
We got two back here for you.
Go for it.
Hi there. North Carolina, and I'm looking at this from a training perspective because I'm in training, and we've got on our backlog of development for courses, something similar to this, just to get that conversation started and build a training around this. So this has been very helpful for me to just, push that out to our folks from a training perspective. So I appreciate all this information.
Good.
I think that's important to kind of start it at that level too.
Yeah. And training is an interesting area too, because, there's a lot of interest in collaboration in that space, not just from universities and community colleges, but even the folks that are out in the consulting and training world. A lot of opportunity for collaboration because, again, I would argue knowledge and insight is not a commodity. It's something that really needs to be very much contextualized to your business. It's a perfect place for collaboration, and it's a pretty low risk area for collaboration to test some of these things out. So interesting that you connected with that. Was there another comment?
Yes, in Kentucky, one thing we have done a few times when conducting an RFI, we've given the vendors community an opportunity to respond with a written proposal, like, you do with the typical RFI.
Yep.
And we've also let them choose to do a one-on-one meeting to present their response to the RFI in person. And they've really liked that. Surprisingly, we haven't had quite as many as we thought. We thought everybody would want to do an oral, but it's been a fairly good response so far. I think they're getting used to it, and that's been pretty successful.
And doing that, what does it provide you? Does it allow you then to probe a little more deeply behind the statements they're making or the offers they're making? What is the value of allowing that oral discussion to take place?
We found that having an oral discussion, the vendor is more apt to provide us with more information about how they would do it. I think they're afraid that if it's a written response, then somehow that information is going to get out to their competitors. So we found that they give us more information that way.
Yeah. That's another really important point, right? When you talk with almost any organization, they will tell you that there's a secret sauce, if I could use that analogy. There's a secret sauce to what they do, right? And when I talk about the importance of visibility and transparency, right? Those things are starting to try and get at what is the secret sauce behind how a supplier operates. Because how a supplier operates is directly relevant to you. It is about your ability to get good outcomes. It is about your ability to manage risk appropriately. But you don't necessarily want all of your competitors to understand your secret sauce. They have no problem with you as a customer understanding the secret sauce. In fact, they probably, in many cases, would like that if you really understood how they were making these things happen effectively and efficiently. But that becomes a big issue for us in the public space, right? When we talk about the ability to be fully transparent with our communities, the ability to have suppliers have access to competitive bidding information, and all of those things that come along with that, right? So that ability to do an oral discussion where you have the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper. Obviously, you're going to need to document everything that comes from that discussion. But what a really nice idea, right? Kind of takes that risk off the supplier, but allows them to open up. And that generally, when suppliers open up, we're going to end up with better outcomes because we understand better what they're really doing to achieve the outcomes we need. Good, good. Are there any other questions or comments here today? I know I've run us a little bit long, and I apologize to that, but I really appreciate the discussion here today. Any other comments or questions as we wrap up? Okay. All right. Well, first of all, again, let me thank the NASPO team for running around with the mic and facilitating this. I'm really disappointed I wasn't able to be there in person. I really think this type of discussion sometimes can be best handled in person when I can stare at somebody and force them to actually say something. But I appreciate all of your flexibility and really the great comments. And I would really encourage you, I think for state procurement, this area of supplier relationships and collaboration is a huge opportunity. I think as we enter these volatile times where so much of what we've relied on in procurement and so much of what we relied on in supply chain in general around predictability is just not going to be there. This type of sharing, this type of knowledge, this type of insight, I think is something that can really, really protect us and protect our states and allow us to succeed in what, again, we anticipate is going to be a very difficult environment. So thank you all for your time and effort. I appreciate the comments and participation and wish you all the best as you wrap up the conference here this morning. With that, Matt, Brandy, I'll turn it back over to you.